Live from the world headquarters of RT America in our nation's capital, this is the news with Rick Sanchez.
And hello again, everybody. I'm Rick Sanchez. It's time to look now at something that's very important to all of us. Recovery, numbers, how we're adjusting, how we're getting out of this situation, both, by the way, at the macro level and at the micro level. In other words, what is Wall Street getting and what is the average worker getting? Look, whether you're a carpenter in Berlin, a plumber in New Delhi, or a house painter in Detroit, this is going to affect you. So let's go over to the wall and let's talk about how those people who I just described are going to be affected by this, because here's what we're learning today. Today, new report, fresh off the press, right? So grocery prices are increasing, and I mean in a big way. They're showing their biggest monthly increase in nearly 50 years last month. This is according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics in the United States government. Biggest jump, meat and eggs. You're now paying 4.3% more for meat and eggs. All in 1 month, by the way. Imagine how much higher it could still get. And by the way, you're going to be paying 1.5% more for fruit and vegetables and 2.9% more for cereals and breads, just on average. You want to talk jobs? Let's talk jobs. New study there, too. This comes out of Stanford University. It says that of all the people who have lost their jobs in the United States so far, 60% of those are going to get their jobs back. Conversely, 40% are not going to get their jobs back. That's a big nut, right? Now, this is based on what's happened historically during recessions, and it's about a month-long study that they have done. Now, let's look at the macro side to this story. And by that, I mean all the free money that is being thrown into the system by governments and central banks all over the world. In the United States, interest rates have been essentially cut to zero, which is, by the way, really good for banks and really good for corporations, right? But maybe not so good for a family trying to save up. Now let's talk about the stimulus or the recovery money or the bailout or whatever you want to call it. It's at the point now where it's almost hard to keep track of, but the number, the consensus, the general consensus on the number that's being used for how much money's been thrown into the system as a result of what we're going through, somewhere around $5 trillion. And there's talk it could still go up based on some of the things that they're discussing in Congress even just today, up to about $8 trillion, right? Same thing happening all over the world. India just this morning announced it's unveiled a new massive stimulus package on top of the one they'd already announced. This one's at $266 billion. They say that's about 10% of their GDP. They call it economic assistance. But it leaves you asking, right? For whom, right? Let's talk about Germany. Another big story going on right now. It's taking place in Germany. And this is interesting because there is a constitutional dispute right now in Germany where the courts are questioning the European Central Bank's right, their right to simply print money as part of their QE without explaining it to German citizens who are going to be negatively affected, right? For example, German savers who are saying, yeah, we agree with this. They should question that because they say they're now going to have to pay the bank just to be able to hold their money. And you have to ask yourself, well, is that fair, right? So suddenly, for the first time, we're starting to see pushback against these central banks. And by the way, there's also another looming question when it comes to this issue that may also be screwing over the average worker. And it's this. What I just described, right? When the market is flooded with money, when real wages and jobs go down, while the prices of goods goes up, folks, what do you got? Almost by definition, this is inflation. Is that where we're headed? Maybe even in a real big way. We're going to talk to some experts right here on the News with Rick Sanchez, where we believe it's time to do news again. Okay, let's do the list, The list of the questions we think you'll be asking tomorrow. Bailouts, stimuluses, fewer jobs. What's it all leading to? Somebody's got to ask. Who's the newest group to descend on Washington asking for its slice of the pie? And what exactly is the new inflammatory risk to children from COVID-19? There's a big development on that story. We're going to bring it to you. Okay, let's begin with the latest on what is developing as the first brewing battle between regular folks, citizens, and that vaulted yet magical and mysterious entity known as the central banks. You know, the people who can create money seemingly out of thin air, right? In Germany, courts, as I mentioned, are pushing back against the central bank, the European Central Bank, by the way, in the name of citizens who they argue don't have enough of a say. So let's start there, shall we? With our correspondent reporting from Berlin. Here is RT's Peter Oliver.
The coronavirus pandemic is putting pressures and strains on many relationships. One of those that's feeling the pinch is that between Brussels and Berlin when it comes to financial burden sharing in the Eurozone. Germany's highest court said the European Central Bank's Corona bond plan would need to prove it was fit for purpose if the single currency's largest economy was to take part. The EU Commission boss didn't like that one bit.
The recent ruling of the German Constitutional Court put under the spotlight two issues of the European Union, the Euro system and the European legal system. The final word on EU law is always spoken in Luxembourg, nowhere else.
So there. Well, not quite. That statement from Ursula von der Leyen gave those that will be vying for the job of German Chancellor next year, when Angela Merkel calls it a day, an opportunity to show just how tough they are.
The statement from the EU Commission, in particular the part that European law always takes precedence over national law, especially in such unconditional form, is simply inaccurate.
Chancellor Merkel herself has said that countries needing a fiscal helping hand due to corona should rely on existing avenues like the European Stability Mechanism, despite the ESM being viewed as a slap in the face by member states like Italy, who remember all too well the crippling austerity that was forced upon Greece after it availed itself of ESM help. There are some voices in Germany, including that of President of the Bundestag and former Finance Minister Wolfgang Schäuble, saying perhaps this isn't the economic hill Berlin should insist on dying on, and that this whole argument puts more than national pride at risk.
It may well be that the existence of the euro is now also questioned in other EU member states, because every national constitutional court can judge for itself.
Make no bones about it, Eurozone economies are going to need some serious financial help, not only in a post-corona world, but in the immediate short and medium term as well. In order to get that help in a way that suits the likes of Italy and Spain, Berlin and Brussels are going to have to stop playing my court's bigger than your court, which doesn't look likely anytime soon. Peter Oliver, RT, Berlin.
It's a fascinating story. Here joining us now to discuss this is former British MP George Galloway, also another George. This is the George Show. George Gammon, who's an investor and expert on the economy with a very large following, by the way, on social media, especially on YouTube, where I often check him out. Galloway, I'm going to begin with you. You're in Europe. It's finally happening, huh? The masses are pushing back against the all-powerful central banks. What do you make of that?
Well, this is really about Germany not being prepared to shoulder a disproportionate burden from the immediate and mid-term and, of course, longer-term devastation caused by the coronavirus. This is a battle of sovereignty. It's a battle between the German government and the supranational European Union authorities. It's one of the good reasons for leaving the European Union, which I'm glad to say we decided to do. We need to get out at the end of the year, or we'll be left to shoulder some of that burden. But the overarching point is one that I'm sure George will have a lot to say about, which is how does it translate printing money, giving it to banks, onto Main Street. Wall Street, fine. The City of London, fine. They are brimming over now with QE money. But how does that get down to the small trader, the small businessman, businesswoman, and the worker at the front? How does it get the house painter, as you put it, back to painting houses? How does it get the butcher shop staying open? These are really very tricky questions if you're going to avoid not just inflation, but stagflation, which is a real danger here, with output slumping, jobs disappearing, and yet lots of money around.
It sounds like it's on your side of the court there, George Gammon. Pick it up for us, will you? What do you make of that? And by the way, let me just share something with my audience. One of the very first persons that I heard publicly talk about inflation, and this is like 2 months ago, is Gammon. He was the first one on his show on YouTube to take us through what was going to happen. I mean, it sounds like, is this what you were talking about, what I was just explaining this morning that the Bureau of Labor Statistics put out?
Yeah, I did. And I saw your segment just before we came on where you're talking about food prices. I was referring to that as well. But going back to what George says, I think he makes some fantastic points. So how is this money supposed to get to the average Joe and Jane on the street? And I think there's going to be a big problem with that. The main reason is because the Fed has kept interest rates artificially low at the long end of the yield curve. So since the yield curve is very flat, it doesn't create a big incentive for banks to lend into Main Street because they borrow short, they lend long. So if there's not much of a spread there, they can't make much money with retail banking. So what do? They look at the collateral that these people are bringing to them, potential borrowers, let's say. And you've got the corporate bailouts. You've got the stock market bailout. You've got Wall Street being bailed out. You've got the billionaires being bailed out. So if you're a bank, you're saying, well, who would I rather lend to? Someone on Main Street, or would I rather lend to a billionaire or a corporation or someone that has collateral in the stock market that I know the Fed is going to backstop with all of this money printing? So when you incentivize the banking system and you create this structure where they can't make money by lending to the average Joe and Jane, but they can make a lot more money with a lot more risk, or with a lot less risk, by lending to these big corporations. That's why the money will never get down to the people who actually need it.
So what happens then? I mean, if that continues, and for how long, what eventually happens to the system? At what point can, to quote the terms we were using before, the house painter trying to start a small business finally break through? Gammon?
Well, I don't think they're going to get too much of a loan. I think they might be able to get some form of assistance with, like, UBI or helicopter money, MMT, whatever you want to call it, that will allow them to buy the staples, the groceries. But unfortunately, then you get yourself into a situation where we're reducing the amount of supply. The supply of goods and services is shrinking because more businesses aren't creating more jobs. And if you get the supply shrinking while at the same time you have more money going to those same goods and services, you have an increase of inflation in that segment. So what that means is you have deflation in prices of things where you need credit. So car loans, maybe homes, but then the price of food, the price of energy long term continues to rise.
What do you make of that, George Galloway?
Well, for me, helicopter money is the most effective way. Give directly to Joe and Jane, because they'll definitely spend it, and they'll spend it locally on local goods and services. What's happening instead is the money's going to the banks, as George Gammon just brilliantly explained, and those banks are giving it to people who've already got plenty and who are not adding to the purchasing power going into the economy. There's one caveat, though, that maybe George can comment on if we've got time. The QE that we've had since 2008 has not led to inflation.
Interesting.
In theory, if you print money, then you're going to get inflation. That was an ineluctable law until now. But it hasn't happened in practice. That's why QE can become very addictive.
Gammon, can you do that in 20 seconds?
Sure. Well, the reason we didn't get inflation is because the only thing they printed was bank reserves. It stayed in the financial economy. It didn't get into the real economy. So now what we're talking about with helicopter money is the money getting into the real system, circulating with velocity, while at the same time, the amount of goods and services shrinks. That's where you get the inflation that I think will actually be counterproductive if you're looking to try to help the average Joe and Jane.
You can't say we don't have smart people here on this newscast to bring you developments of what's going on in the world. My thanks to both Georges. Gentlemen, look forward to seeing you again very soon. By the way, this is the news with Rick Sanchez, and you're watching our special coverage of what's going on around the world. And the latest has to do with a new illness that's affecting children that may be affecting or may be tied to COVID-19. We're all over it. That's coming up next. Don't go away. Hey, welcome back. I'm Rick Sanchez, and here's what we're focusing on today. We just told you a little while ago what's going on with Main Street versus Wall Street, who's getting what. Meanwhile, there's another group that's descending on the U.S. Capitol today. They're demanding, not to be left out. Yesterday, we told you how hundreds of independent truckers, fully loaded with their rigs, came to Washington to complain about how the big syndicates are getting bailed out, but not them. Today, there's yet another group kind of arguing in the same form. For more on that, let's go live once again to RT correspondent Michelle Greenstein, who's joining us from the streets of Washington, D.C. Who now, and what do they want, Michelle?
Rick, we're talking about motor coaches, these buses. I'm at the Motor Coaches Rolling for Awareness rally, and about 1,000 buses are circling the Capitol right now. They came from all over the country, Texas, Ohio, California, New Jersey, and they have a very specific demand. They want $15 billion, and they want it from the federal government in the form of loan guarantees and grants. Now, as you know, the response to the COVID-19 outbreak has really caused this kind of bus travel to, all but halt. Right? So as a result, the industry has been virtually decimated. These motor coach companies say that over 80% of their trips have either been canceled or simply not booked to begin with. And about 90% of the industry's 100,000 workers have been laid off. 90%. So like I said, the industry has been virtually decimated. And some of these bus operators are saying that coming here is really about them fighting to stay alive. Now, you may know motor coaches in terms of tourism, but they also transport essential workers, they transport the U.S. military, they transport FEMA, sports teams, school kids, all the people that we don't even think about moving back and forth across the country. In fact, the U.S. bus industry moves over 600 million people each year. 600 million. Now, I want to throw another number at you, okay? 700 million. That's how much the airline industry transports each year. So they've got about 100 million more people, but they've also got a $25 billion bailout from the federal government in April. So what these bus operators and these companies are saying is that they also need federal assistance, but they're actually being left out. Now, I want to zoom out and take a look at the big picture for a minute here, at least in terms of the United States. Now, the red states that you're about to see are the states where there are still lockdown policies in place. They either have shelter-in-place orders or they have stay-at-home orders. Now, in the green states, there's no statewide, nationwide stay-at-home order in place. It's either been lifted or they never had one to begin with. So, Rick, as we watch this unfold, right, whatever that means, whether it's a possible re-shutting down of the economy or whether it's a long-term new normal, the big question is, as governments, not just in the United States, enact these lockdown policies, will the reopening and restructuring of society occur without some companies? Maybe the companies that can't afford to operate at a loss for long periods of time. Yesterday we talked about how the restaurant industry is seeing the more independent businesses go out of business, and how the trucking industry is seeing these smaller firms also go out of business because they can't operate at a loss. So if these bus operators and companies don't get some of the relief they're asking for, we might have to add them to the list of entities fighting not to go obsolete.
This is interesting, Michelle. It's the second day in a row you've kind of had to hit the road. I know you're just blocks away from us here. We're in our nation's capital with entities coming here to tell their story, to say, hey, we're being left out. Look at me, right? Is this a trend?
Look at me, I can't operate at a loss. It certainly seems that way. And like I said, it's not just these bus companies. This is just, the group that's gathered here in the Capitol today. Good
stuff. Michelle Greenstein, as usual. Great job following that story for us out there on the streets of Washington, D.C. I want to follow up on a story now that we've been looking into all this week because, I mean, this could really be a game changer on the COVID-19 front. We told you there's a rare new illness out there that affects children. It's a pediatric inflammatory illness known in many circles as Kawasaki disease. And there's reason to believe that it may be brought on by the coronavirus in some way, shape, or form. And in New York, they're now looking into 102 potential cases of this. RT correspondent Trinity Chavez has the story.
Today, more uncertainty surrounding the mysterious illness impacting children across the U.S. At least 14 states and 5 countries are investigating cases of a rare pediatric syndrome potentially linked to coronavirus.
We're seeing that all over the world now with young children. It's a phenomenon that's just been brought to everyone's attention a couple of weeks ago.
New York State leading a national effort investigating at least 102 cases, 60% of which testing positive for COVID-19 and 40% testing positive for the antibodies, the illness claiming the lives of 3 children.
On the age, when they say children, it's across the board. It can be under 1 year old, it can be up to 20, 21-year-old, majority between 5 years old and 14 years old.
New York City now reporting 82 cases of pediatric multi-system inflammatory syndrome, or PMIS.
There's things we don't know. We don't know what makes kids specifically susceptible, why some kids and not others. It's still, even though it's a striking number, it's a small number compared to the number of kids in the city or even the number of kids who have been exposed to COVID.
The rare but serious syndrome, which inflammation affects the heart and other organs, can send the body into shock. Common symptoms include fever, rash, abdominal pain, vomiting, and red or irritated eyes. The illness leaving so many questions left unanswered. The city's health commissioner advising families to try to remain indoors as much as possible.
The reality is that we're still learning about the way in which COVID-19 is affecting children. And so in terms of prevention, the most important thing is, again, for families to remain indoors as much as possible. When they go outdoors for activities, they should use face coverings. Children above the age of 2 should be using face coverings.
Neighboring Connecticut confirming 5 children have the illness. This comes as a 6-month-old baby girl from the Bay Area in California is believed to be the first to contract the coronavirus and Kawasaki disease. Meantime, according to the National Library of Medicine, Kawasaki disease occurs approximately 1 in every 10,000 children under the age of 5 every year. Reporting in New York, Trinity Chavez, RT.
A fascinating story. Obviously, it's rare. It's a new development. We're going to stay on top of it for you. Now, I don't know if you've heard of Telegram. It's essentially a more private way of communicating where your messages kind of disappear after the person who you send it to receives it. In other words, it's not traceable. Sorry, intrusive governments and anyone else out there who wants to get into your business. Now, the owner of Telegram wanted to do the same thing with a cryptocurrency. The technology would create an open, free, decentralized exchange of value and ideas. Sounds great, right? No, not great, says a U.S. court, who is stopping this from happening. Joining us now is my colleague Ben Swan to explain what's going on, what is it, what was it going to be, and why is the court saying no way? Ben?
Yeah. So Rick, let's start with what exactly took place here. So Telegram, as you said, you gave a great explanation for what Telegram is. For folks who haven't, they understand how it works, right? It's end-to-end encryption. It's privacy through messaging. It's very different than what we have through other tech companies. Then what they did was they created something called TON, or the Telegram Open Network, which was going to have a cryptocurrency attached to it, which they were going to call grams. Mm-hmm. And those grams were part of what was called an ICO, an initial coin offering. 2.5 years ago, it was the second largest initial coin offering ever. $1.7 billion was raised from around the world from investors in order to create this TON network, along with these gram cryptocurrencies that would represent the investment of the people who put money into it. The problem is that in October of 2019, the SEC came forward and said, nope, this doesn't count. This is not a properly registered security, even though it was done offshore. It was not done here in the U.S. and then has continued to fight them. Now, a U.S. District Court judge has ruled that not only can those Graham tokens not be distributed here in the U.S., they cannot be distributed anywhere in the world. It doesn't matter if people around the world want them, have invested in this, and believe in it. The U.S. is actually blocking this project from moving forward anywhere on planet Earth, and as a result of that, the TON project is now dead.
That's a defiance of free market principles, is it not?
It's a defiance of free market principles. It's also a defiance of international boundaries. It's a defiance of everything that we would believe in terms of something happening in another country. If people in another country want to invest in a cryptocurrency, who is the U.S. government and the U.S. District Court judge and the SEC to tell them you can't do that? And the judge claimed, Rick, that because people in the United States might still be able to somehow access Telegram's network, this TON network, and might be able to get a hold of a Graham, that they could block it worldwide.
Wow. What a great explanation. As usual, thanks so much, Ben Swan, for taking us through that. And I bet they want to be able to tax you, too. That's our news. I'm Rick Sanchez. Stay safe. Stay connected. Check out Portable TV so you can check us out anytime you want and keep us in your back pocket, so to speak. We'll see you again soon when it's time to do news again.